In this video, we're going to discuss the concept of economics. So economics is a social science, just like political science, sociology, anthropology, which is a little surprising to some people because a lot of people think that economics is just about money. But economics is actually a science that's examining how people make choices, right? So similar to things like psychology and sociology, where we study how individuals or groups make choices, with economics, we're seeing how people make choices in the context of having unlimited wants and desires and yet having limited resources available to fulfill those wants and desires. And what I mean by that is this. So we all want things. We want better health care. We want better schools. We want to make more money. We want to live longer. We have all these wants and desires, and yet there are limited means to fulfill those desires, right? So we might want, for example, for everybody in the world to have electricity and to be able to just flip a switch and to have lights in their home and to have heat and all those things. And so the question is, well, do we have the resources right now available to be able to have all those all the electricity and the things and clean water and so forth for all the people in the world? And you might say, well, yes, actually there's plenty of water and there's plenty so forth. But there's not an infinite amount of water. There's not an infinite amount of coal, of natural gas. There might be a lot of some of those things, and you might argue that there's enough that we can find a way that we could allocate to all the different people and make everybody happy. But the fact is that the resources are limited. There's a finite supply of resources. And so economics is about, hey, how do we deal with the fact that we have a finite supply of resources, and how do we find ways, how do we make choices to be able to satisfy people's wants and desires? And that's going to involve things like trade-offs, right? So we want more electricity. Let's, for example, we want people in India. We want everybody in India to have electricity. And then somebody says, okay, well, to do that, we're going to need to produce some coal. And then somebody else says, okay, well, for producing that coal, what is going to happen to carbon dioxide emissions and so forth? So we think about carbon emissions. And then somebody else would say, hey, look, we need to think about these people's quality of life, and it's really more important that we get electricity. And then, so we're thinking about all these things. And again, it's not just about money. It's about people's standard of living. It's about even families. There's an entire branch of economics called family economics, which was started by a guy named Gary Becker. And we can think about things like how families decide how many children to have, how families decide whether they want to invest in the education of those children. Do they want to educate all of their children or just pick the smartest one? And that might seem immoral to you. You might think, hey, well, why would people make these choices? They should always choose to have the best health care. They should always choose to educate every child as much as they possibly can. But again, resources are finite, and some people might be in a situation where they have to make difficult choices. And economics is about studying how people make those decisions. The fundamental economics problem is that we have all these wants and desires, but we have finite resources to satisfy those wants and desires. So let's study how people make those choices. And ultimately, we can divide economics into two branches. It's a lot more complicated than this. I mean, we can think about things like behavioral economics, where we start saying, what about when people don't behave rationally, when they don't do something that might be in their best interest and so forth? And we'll talk about that. But there's really two primary branches of economics that you'll hear about, and you have individual courses in each of them. You'll have microeconomics and you'll have macroeconomics. And with microeconomics, we're examining the behavior of individual economic actors. And when I say individuals, it doesn't just mean a person, although that's what it could very often be the case, but it could also be a firm, right? So we could look at a corporation and see how a corporation behaves and so forth. So when I talk about just people or individuals, we can think about people, we can think about firms and so forth. We can even think about societies, but generally we've got these individual economic actors. We want to know how they behave. So we might ask, how do people respond to a change in price? Or how do people respond to a tax? For example, let's say that we increase a cigarette tax. how is that going to affect the behavior of people who smoke cigarettes? How is that going to affect the behavior of children who haven't decided to smoke cigarettes yet? Will they be less likely to do so, and so forth? So we can think about how a tax would affect individuals' behaviors and so forth. So microeconomics is looking at individuals and firms and so forth and saying, how do they behave in the environment? Well, macroeconomics, we're looking at aggregate economic indicators, things like gross domestic product, which we'll talk about in videos to come. But basically, when we say aggregate, we're thinking about the entire economy. So if we think, for example, of the U.S., the United States, we say we're looking at the gross domestic product. That's all the goods and services produced by everyone, the entire economy, all of the people that are living in the United States and so forth. And we're not just thinking about, oh, well, what about this individual person or this individual group of people? We're aggregating these things and looking at GDP. We're looking at inflation, these large scale measures that can be measured at the country level or at the state level. And we're looking at how those economic indicators change over time and how different things affect them. And we're going to talk a lot more about microeconomics and macroeconomics and the different types of exciting field of economics in the videos to come.